If you're all nice, I'll finish a little bit early. So, is everyone having a good time? Yeah? Well, we'll put a stop to that. In America, there are a few things you shouldn't talk about in a conversation. One of them is capital punishment, which for those of you that don't know is killing someone because they killed someone. Abortion, politics, religion, and CSS methodologies. All right? So who here uses a CSS framework or methodology, something like that? Quite a few. Okay, we're going to have some fun. All right? We're going to play a little game. You ready? This is called Recognize the CSS Methodology. Here we go. Can you see it? Can you read that? What methodology is this? Just call it out. SMAX. Very good. SMAX, right from the page. What about this one? This is hard, right? OOCSS, correct. What about that? BEM. Everyone knows it right away, right? What gave it away? Is it the 2 underscores? The 2 underscores are like a cowboy hat of CSS. What about this one? It's hard to see you. Anyone know it? This is, yes, ACSS, which I affectionately refer to as ass. And everyone has seen this before, right? It stems from long ago. Okay? So that's funny. So now get a show of hands. Who uses OOCSS here? Okay, not many. I guess it's kind of old school. Old school CSS. What about SMAX? A few of you. It's. Right. Who uses BEM? Wow. Okay. We'll all go to BEM and Jerry's afterwards. Who uses ass? Anyone? So I see all these names, and I'm like, why are there so many of these things? And it occurred to me, they're actually trying to build a language. Please don't be offended about this talk. The snarky subtweets started happening yesterday. People in anticipation of this talk. I'm not going to offer you an answer. Okay, I'm not going to be one of those people who stands up and says, you're doing it wrong, and you should do it this way, which would also be wrong, okay? I will try to poke holes in every methodology equally, but don't be offended, because some of it's in good fun, even though it's serious, and just ignore the fact that I'm right for a while. So why are there actually so many of these frameworks and methodologies? It's because lots of different, very smart people have had to solve lots of different, very difficult problems. Okay, OOCSS was developed first at Yahoo and then continued at Facebook by Nicole Sullivan. SMAX was at Yahoo Mail. Jonathan Snook started using it then, and then at Shopify again later. BEM was developed at Yandex. These are really big sites with a lot of specific, very, very big problems. But these problems are not necessarily your problems. They're not necessarily my problems. What happens is that in the spirit of sharing, people take these methodologies that they've come up with that have helped them with their problems, and they put them out there into the world. They don't say this is the right way to do everything, but we kind of do that. We take these things and then we make this kind of a religion out of it. So that's one reason that we appropriate these methodologies into our own work, even though they might not be that appropriate for what we're doing. And there is another reason that we appropriate other people's solutions to their problems and apply them to our own. And that's that we're obsessed with tools. It's a thing we have. I'm still inappropriately tingly about Roy's presentation. Okay, I love that stuff, and I think we all love new things and playing around with them. And when we do that, we're generally thinking in terms of benefits to us as developers, right? And not necessarily any kind of other benefits. So I'll come back to that in a bit. PPK recently wrote a blog post, kind of an inflammatory blog post. I tend to call them PPK bombs. Every once in a while, one of these posts comes out and it's just, right? But he said tools don't solve problems anymore. They've become the problem. And he was referring to more JavaScript frameworks. It's just almost gotten out of hand. But if you look at all of what we're doing in CSS, it's kind of getting out of hand as well. CSS is pretty complex as it is, right? And did you notice when we were going through all those different examples, did you notice something about all of the examples of the different methodologies? And those aren't all of them. Anyone notice anything? Just call it out. I didn't show any CSS. It's all HTML. Yet we call them CSS methodologies, okay? And some hefty claims are made about these methodologies. People say we use these because they're better for performance, because complex selectors take longer to parse, right? They say that the CSS within these methodologies is not as tightly coupled with the markup as it would be if we just did normal CSS, right? It's more maintainable because we have to do less refactoring. So let's look at these three things. There are a lot more claims, but we have to look critically at these things. Performance. Steve Souders, luckily, I've had quite a bit of contacts with him just doing work on HTTP archive, and I was able to just mail him with this question. And I think that if someone knows a little bit about performance, it would be Steve Souders, right? And so he said this in 2009. Okay, 6 years ago, he talked about the fact that optimizing CSS selectors, you could do it, but the effect of that would be negligible on performance. And then he wrote this to me. It only becomes a factor if you have a large number of DOM elements and complex CSS selectors. If you have 20,000 DOM elements and 200 complex selectors, it could be bad. If you have 2,000, it could be bad. But most pages have 900 DOM elements and about 50 complex selectors. So optimizing those 50 complex selectors will not produce a notable improvement in performance. You might know more about performance than I do, but I don't know more about performance than Steve, so I'll kind of listen to that. Another argument is tight coupling. This and this, which is what I would probably write, I guess, if I'm honest about it. Within the nav, any li is going to have these styles, just kind of normal selector type thing. This is what a lot of proponents of these methodologies would call tightly coupled, because this is tightly coupled on that. But apparently, this is not tightly coupled. Okay? So we'll come back to that as well. And the other argument about less refactoring, it is true, but HTML is now your closet. So when you have people over and you have to clean up really quickly because your parents-in-law are coming over or something like that, you just pick up everything and throw it in the closet, right? So now everything, your room looks fantastic, but all your shit's in the closet, okay? So HTML is now your closet because you took it out of the CSS, you put it in the HTML, right? So now you can do all that refactoring in your HTML, and you don't have to do it for one rule. You get to do it on every single instance of every element that needs to have all those classes, right? And it depends on how you do it, and I know, well, we've got a system for that, and we only have to change it in one spot. I also know that in very large organizations where these things are used, that it can take you 2 days to get just one line of CSS changed or one bit of markup changed because it has to go through this whole windmill of people, right, to get this change request approved. So I see some possible problems with a lot of these methodologies, okay? And I see some problems with the purist idea of, don't use classes, make really complex selectors and stuff like that. So there are a lot of problems. And one of them is that we're trying to approach CSS as if it were a programming language. And this is what's happening with JavaScript frameworks as well. With all respect to programmers out there, we have to get used to that. Those of us who are not programmers but who can code, because there is a difference, we're not used to that. We have CSS, which is not a programming language, but people who program, They kind of want a programming language. They're like, man, it's almost like they feel that CSS is a defective programming language, which is not, okay? Don't try to make it into a programming language. So Tom Morris had the 50 lies that programmers believe. Number 20 is CSS could be object-oriented or functional rather than a declarative rules language with a moderately complex inheritance model. And this is true. Barrett Boss has once said that if you want to do stuff that a programming language does, use a programming language. We've got tons of them, right? And that's exactly what we do with preprocessors. Someone said, I'm going to use Ruby to do the stuff that I can't do in CSS, and then they made Sass with it, okay? Which is great, if you see all the stuff that Roy did. So what we're usually trying to do is take something, square a peg, put it in a round hole. That's kind of what we're doing, right? Another problem that I see is that most of the class-based methods, they solve problems that we create ourselves. And I'll give you an example of that. This is a site, I'm sorry I blurred it out, but it's not live yet, so I can't show it. So we're working on this thing, and we have this contact person kind of module or component. But it appears differently wherever you see it. So here we've got, it's in a gray box, it's kind of in a sidebar, and here it's within an overview, and you have some less information, there's less information in there. It's styled just slightly differently. So that's kind of one component. It doesn't make sense to make two components because they're very small changes. So we made one component. And then with the idea of, separating all this stuff, we kind of we're using Sass, so we take that component out, we put it in its own partial, and so you know the deal. A lot of you probably do that. And then once you start like taking these elements, these components, and pulling them into separate files, it becomes harder to visualize your whole inheritance model, right? So suddenly you're getting these things that a lot of people would call side effects, which is another programming term. And they're kind of frustrated with what they call the global scope, which is another programming term, right? So everything is global in CSS, right? But you can scope things with things like classes. But that's what we're doing. And eventually we have to kind of contain this thing. We have to isolate it from from any possibility that any styles will trickle down to it, okay? So what we did was we split this thing into a component, we removed it, and we put it in a place which makes it hard for us to visualize this whole inheritance that's going on. And then we have to find a solution for that problem that we just created. And in larger companies, there's one person in the audience who will know exactly what I'm talking about. We worked on a project at a very large company where they were using Google Web Toolkit, and don't laugh. I wasn't using it, they were using it, but they had everything split up into 1,000 pieces, and it was really, really hard to get anything done. So the stuff that I could do in the browser in DevTools just to make a quick design mockup, it would take them a couple days to do. So that makes it pretty hard. So with this project here, with these little components, I kind of did it like this, which the styles that both versions of the component needed, you just put in here. So you scope it with a class, which a lot of you are familiar with BEM and all that kind of thing. And then when you add another class, it has the exceptions to the original contact person component, right? And here you have different exceptions to that. So it's pretty simple because I don't have a methodology that I use, but I end up doing stuff like this. And that's okay, and there are probably better ways to do it, and those are okay too, right? But this is what happens. And John Daggett last night at dinner, he said that modularization encourages over-design. And so what happens when we modularize everything, we start getting these problems and we start adding solutions on solutions on solutions. And before you know it, we end up with a lot of these class-based methodologies. And obviously, these methodologies are not good for everyone, because if they were, then we would only have one of them, right? So apparently, CSS wasn't working for Yahoo Mail, or it wasn't appropriate for them. So that should tell us something. All right. So this is another thing. This is from the BEM introduction. When it comes to larger, more complex projects, how you organize your code is a key to efficiency, not only in how much time it takes, but also how much code you write and how much a browser has to load. This is especially important when you're working with a team of themers and when performance is important. I love the word themers. We just slap some decoration on there. But this implies, right, that your code, how you organize your code is going to solve all kinds of different problems. But class-based methodologies are not going to solve your organizational problems. Okay? So we can try to solve everything with CSS. It's funny, everyone complains about CSS, but they think, yeah, we can solve all the problems with it. So that's a problem, I think. Another problem is that we're teaching people that these ways of working with CSS are the correct ways to work. Oftentimes, newcomers to the field will, they'll just learn on something like Bootstrap. So this obsession with tools, which I noticed in the days of static comps, which we still have really, but I gave lectures at a college where on web design, and I said, let's get sketching, and people jumped into Photoshop right away because it's a tool. And it seems like a lot of education is tool-based rather than principle-based, which we need more of, the principle-based education. So you get this on Stack Overflow, these kind of questions. This is a CSS question, right? Used to be, it'd be like, how do I vertically center something, right? Which we didn't have an answer to and still don't in many cases. How do I do a layout? Well, it took 17 years, but we got it, This kind of thing you get now. I've got Bootstrap. So what do you need to know as a newcomer? You need to know CSS and Bootstrap and BEM and Grunt and all these things, right? There's a lot to learn. And I think that every single one of us here, myself included, there's a bunch of stuff in CSS that we don't even know, that we could learn new ways of doing things. I'm amazed when I come to these talks. When Tab Atkins was here, I'm just kind of, my jaw was here. But again today, Fantasy, we're so glad to have her here. And it's crazy, the stuff we don't know. And then we're adding all this stuff to it. So that's a problem too, that we seem to need an increasing number of frameworks, methodologies, and stuff like that. So it used to be, you write a couple lines of CSS, right? Everyone can do it. So you learn some CSS, and you can write some CSS. But then you're like, well, that Sass, that's pretty cool. We're going to use Sass. I'm going to add some Sass to it. I want to do layout stuff, but layout, so I don't want to do the math, that stupid math that I have to do float layouts. So I'll start using Suzy, right? And all those vendor prefixes, I don't want to write those, so we got auto prefixer to do that. And I want to minify my CSS because it's going to be larger because I'm adding all this stuff to it, right? But in order to do all these things, I don't want to do that by hand every time. What are you, crazy? So we got Grunt. Well, we might have Gulp. If you don't like Grunt, you have Gulp. So I need to install Grunt, which means I need to install Node.js and NPM, right? So suddenly you have this huge amount of dependencies that you have, and it's insane, right? So what else is going to happen? What else are we going to get? What happens when Node becomes unpopular and something else is popular? What happens when you have the wrong version of Sass working with the wrong version of Suzy, which I've had to deal with before? That's not how I want to spend 2 hours, right? Fixing that kind of stuff. So what do? You add another thing, bundler, which takes care of all those version dependencies for you. Okay? And we want a magical methodology that works for every single project. And one of the arguments that I always hear from people is, well, that works for the little barbershop sites that you probably work on, but we work on large-scale, complex websites. Large-scale and complex, we used to call that enterprise, right? Microsoft Word is a large-scale, complex word processor, okay? These are the companies who brought you waterfall processes, right? Which we're trying to avoid. Why do we have Agile and Scrum? Because people rebelled against all that stuff that's large-scale and complex. It's not necessarily something to brag about if your company is so large scale and complex that you have to have 5 meetings and take 2 days to get 1 line of code changed. That's a bad thing. And you're not going to solve it with CSS. You're certainly not going to solve it by throwing a bunch of classes into your HTML. Okay? But having said that, all of us are right. So if you use BEM, you're right. It might be good for your project, okay? Because my name is Steven, and I've added these classes to client projects because it would help the client. All right? You see these? This is something, I just feel dirty even showing this to you, but it's like true confessions, okay? Whole, half, thirds, first, last, highlight. This is so my client, who happened to know HTML, wanted to do some stuff like layout stuff. And I wanted to make it easy for them, and I also wanted to prevent them from breaking the website. So I gave them some classes. All they had to do was put some kind of container element and add a class to it, and it would take care of the layout for them. So I kind of restrict that. I don't know. Just to show you that I'm not holier than thou, right? This is the kind of stuff you do, right? Because these problems that we're having are real, and the tools and methodologies do help solve some of our problems. But what I find is when talking to people, I don't think a lot of us think critically enough about all the stuff that we're adding to our projects. I think that we want to solve a lot of problems with the methods that we choose, and once we choose a method, we want the method, and we want to use it all across the board in every single project. And that's not thinking critically about what you need. What are your problems, and what do you need to solve those problems? So there are no best practices. Okay, and that's pretty much the message today, which you might think that's kind of a letdown. It's kind of an it depends, but it depends with a caveat, right? Which is that you have to solve the problems that are there and solve actual problems, and not, go into this little corner and be solving problems that just distract you from the real issues at hand, okay? So I have some thoughts about things that we can do, not necessarily solutions, but things to think about. And the first of those is that inheritance is pretty powerful. Are you sure you don't want it? The cascade and inheritance, to me, and as I was talking about with some people outside, the fact that browsers ignore CSS that they don't understand, I think those are arguably some of the most compelling reasons to use CSS. Right? When I talk, usually I'm talking about browser-based web design or code-based web design instead of static image comps. One of the advantages is that you have this inheritance model that you can use so that you can change something in one place and have those relative changes trickle down to whatever needs those things. If you isolate every component, you have to go and change every single component. And that might seem more maintainable, but I'm convinced that when done cleverly, inheritance is a huge win for a lot of people and a lot of you. So I would say think about that. Another thing is to just embrace the chaos. We have projects are just messy, right? At the end of every project, does anyone feel like total crap at the end of a project? Anyone at all? Yeah. So you all know what I'm talking about. We're friends here. I start a project, I'm like, this project is going to be the best project I have ever done, ever. It's going to be the cleanest code. People are going to, they'll smell how clean it is from miles away. And they're going to say, wow, you are the best. And then you start working, and then someone says, hey, what about this deadline? The client wants to see this. Here's another deadline. Oh, shit. And before you know it, you're like, okay, there's one thing I won't do, right? I won't use important. That's it. That's the only thing I won't do. But complex selectors, yeah. Oh, I recently worked on a Drupal project. You know what Drupal does? Yeah, see, I hear the sighs in the audience right now. You know what it does? When you're logged in, it adds an invisible div to everything. So there goes your whole nth child stuff, right? Because it just screws up everything. You've got this extra div in there and that you didn't account for. So what that is for like, there's a little widget that you can edit that little component on the screen. Just the bane of any Drupal person's existence. So glad I don't do a lot of that. But it's a messy place. Our projects are really messy, and it's okay to screw up. It's okay to get to that place because, as you heard, everybody has a project, almost every project that starts, and it starts well, and it's going well, and then you don't have time, and then you put little hacks in there and things to get things done, because that's your job, right? So when you get things done, even if it's messy, you're actually doing your job. You're solving the problem at hand, which is I've got a deadline, and we've got to get this thing done. And we all comment that in the code and say, I think Harry Roberts has he puts stuff in a separate file. It's like the shame.css or something. So my shame.css is like that big. The actual normal good CSS is that big. I think everybody has that. And you always put in comments, we're going to change that later. Do you ever change it? No. You never go back and change it. So all these arguments about maintainability, yeah, maintaining that thing that you're never going to change later, that's what we're talking about. Just embrace it. It's just, part of our business. And it's depressing, We're all going to end up leaving the industry. So thanks. Have a nice day. All right, here's another thing that I've been talking about a lot lately. Start simply. What if we started a project, every project, acting like we had no existing design or technological baggage? We could start however we wanted. And I know we can't do this in real life, but what if we just used that as a thinking exercise? What would you do? How would you do things if you were able to start over completely for this particular project? Would you have Sass and Grunt and all those things for your little one-page, site for your new app or whatever it is? Would you do that? If you wouldn't, maybe there's a chance that you can throw some of that baggage away and just keep things simple. Things are inherently simple. That's the beauty of what Zoe was talking about this morning, progressive enhancement. You've got something that works everywhere. We're going to add something to this so that it's better for people who can experience that. And if they don't, they've got the first thing. That's progressive enhancement. So that type of thinking, when applied to your project workflow, can be very interesting. Okay? Respecting the content. This is very important. Paul was talking about the universality of the web. These little chunks of content, which is what the web actually is, with a bunch of layers of stuff on top to make an experience out of it, that is what it's all about. And even if you have an app, you have content. That content needs to be accessible to everyone, and it can be when you progressively enhance. You take this chunk of content, whatever it is, and you can move it to anything. You don't have to worry about what form factors are coming up in the next few years, because it doesn't really matter. Anyone would be able to get to this content, right? So you need to respect that content and try to divorce that from the pet technologies and methodologies and things like that we're using, if it's possible, right? Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes you're using a framework or something in your big company, large scale and complex company, and you can't change it. And that's unfortunate. I'm sure that most of you will eventually leave out of frustration, but you need to try to seek independence from the technology you're using. So there's no sense in bringing these things together. We had that. We had content mixed, structured content mixed with presentation. And then we talked for years about pulling them apart, and now we're just putting them back together again. It's kind of weird how that works. Many years ago, I did some accessibility consulting for this website, which looked way different back then. And this is a website where, a Dutch website where people can go and find providers of medical treatment and care. And this site has over 400 content providers. At least it did back when I consulted with them. over 400 content providers. They get all types of HTML. Sometimes they get Markdown. Sometimes they get HTML just pure and clean. Sometimes they get like BEM-like HTML, with classes and IDs and whatever you can put in there. And they have to actually actively ignore, or they had to actively ignore, I don't know how it works now, all of these extra elements in, or attributes in the HTML. They had to just treat it as plain HTML, which is a good thing, right? Because these documents are meant to be readable. Sometimes the HTML was so bad that they couldn't do much with it, but they couldn't change it, right? They'd get this from different web services. Okay, so that's pretty tough to deal with. But these are the types of real problems that people have. This is a large-scale, complex website as well. It might not look it, but it is. So this whole thing, right, talking about divorcing these two things, you've got these two classes here, and then you've got this UL element. It's a nav element, which we have in HTML, but for some reason is not being used here. I don't know why. But what happens if someone decides it's not BEM, it's ZEM? So ZEM is the new thing. It's like what gulp is to grunt, ZEM is to BEM, right? So we're now using ZEM. It's totally different because we use Unicode arrows instead of underscores or something like that. We'll take this and we'll pull it away from the CSS. We're going to totally rewrite our CSS, right? So what happens? What does this UL do? It's crying. Do you hear it? It's crying for mommy. Mommy's up here, right? It needs that. This is an artifact. You put an artifact of your particular pet developer technology into the structure of your content. So there are a lot of people who have been talking about solutions to this, or possible solutions. This is, well, he's German. I don't know how to say his name, but Gunnar sounds pretty cool to me, right? So Gunnar Bittersman, he had this presentation, which you should probably watch because it's interesting, about how to use preprocessors to do a lot of the stuff that you would normally put into your markup, but do it on the CSS side of things. It does involve making selectors that a BEM purist probably wouldn't appreciate that much, but I still think it's interesting to look at all these methods. I see benefits to things like BEM and OOCSS and all these different things. There are absolutely benefits, otherwise they wouldn't exist. But there are also benefits to other approaches as well, and I think we need to be open to those approaches. Hayden Pickering has done a lot of talking about what he calls axiomatic CSS, and when he gives a talk, he gets a slightly higher amount of snarky comments on Twitter than I do, luckily, because I just blame Hayden. But he had this really interesting thing. Anyone read this before, this article? Okay, you should read it. The lobotomized owl selector, which is a star plus star, right? And it's interesting, if you read this article, why he came up with this and why it could be useful. And of course, he got all these comments about, well, that's not performant and all that kind of thing. So it's just something to look at. This is a way of writing CSS that is kind of independent of how many pieces of content you might have within a given container, and things will still work out okay. So it's preparing actually for what the web is, a space where you don't exactly know what's going to happen. You don't know what the content managers are going to put in at all times, right? So you can only account for certain things, and he's trying to account for more. So it's also an interesting approach. It won't solve all the problems, but it is interesting. Another thing is that refactoring is a good thing. What's wrong with refactoring? Everyone's like, I don't want to go and, because then I'll have to add a selector. Ooh. There's this thing I found. It's called a text editor. And you can go in and you can put your cursor somewhere and you can type a new selector. It's amazing. It's not a bad thing to refactor. Every time you go into your code, you might be able to fix some things up. and make it better. So Ron Jeffrey said refactoring isn't rework, it's a revision. It's not doing it completely anew, right? And I think the last thing that's really important is documentation. And we've heard a lot about namespacing, like what I showed you that I did myself with classes, but that's not enough. Just the fact that you use a methodology is not enough because everyone does it slightly differently. Harry Roberts' interpretation of BEM-like syntax has become ITCSS, which is slightly different, but you can see the heavy BEM influence. That's still not enough. So you have to document. And we sometimes put code comments, but that's not enough. We want people to understand what we're doing. So we have to actually write prose that people can understand, right? Even BEM does it on their site. They have documentation. It's pretty sparse, which means there's some interpretation possible. So in that sense, kind of like Bible, documentation. And for those of you who really like tools for writing documentation, because you like tools, I like tools, ASCII Doctor. ASCII Doc is kind of, a plain text markup format, not completely different from Markdown, but it has a lot more to it. And ASCII Doctor is a really cool tool that'll just like instantly give you this kind of documentation. You want a table of contents, it's just one line in a header of a document that says, make a table of contents for me. Right? It's literally :TOC:, and then you've got automatic table of contents. This is great stuff because it allows you to write actual words, and not this trend that we're seeing with style guides, which are not really style guides, but actually just pieces of our site pulled out with like the name of the element next to it. It's not helping a lot of people. Okay? And one more thing that's really important is to stop teaching people that this is how you write CSS. There's not really a way to write CSS, but it's very important that we don't teach things as the way to write CSS. It makes things hard for people that are new to the industry, and it makes things hard for people who have been in the industry for many, many years. Okay, so just keep things simple, right? CSS is about writing exceptions. Respect the content, and think critically, okay? And with that, thank you.
Wherever.
I'll take this one.
I like that the health provider website shows a header full of cows. It's kind of odd. I was in South America the other day in Brazil, and they have a 24-hour channel on television where you can buy cows. Like you can buy bulls.
Did no
and
one
stuff.
ask a question on Twitter? Is that what this is?
Yeah. No, you get home and you're like, darling, I got drunk. I bought 3 cows again. Damn it, I'm going to give a talk in New York in 2 days, slightly similar. And the thing that fascinates me, I'm not going to go into the methodology thing, but let's flip that around a bit. Like our messaging at these events and our messaging in keeping things clean and keeping things separated is always like, in 7 years' time, in 15 years' time, in 20 years' time, this will still work. Oh, look at the first website. It's responsive, it's beautiful, it has blue text, and it really works, and this is just a website. Are we not working for a market where nobody gives a shit about 20 years from now and everybody wants to make money in the next 3 months?
Yeah.
So how can we solve that problem? Is it time we stop going to our own conferences and go to those where the terrible things happen?
I think you can be principled and do things because you believe that's the right way to do things. I believe in the web as interlinked pieces of structured content that should always be available and accessible to everybody. That's the way I think about it, and I know that I'm not alone in that. And there's nothing wrong with keeping those kind of ideals. You can do everything. It's just like maybe when we first met each other many, many years ago, when I was doing a lot of accessibility work, accessible websites looked awful. It's like they're just plain text, really, with links. And we kind of set out to prove that you can make accessible websites that are beautiful, that fit a brand, that are immersive in some way. And you can still do that. There's no reason to just throw the baby out with the bathwater just because there's a lot of bad stuff going on,
I lost faith when I got this headline on TechCrunch, and I keep repeating that, like, Sean Diddy Coombs allegedly poised to invest in picture messaging app Pleek built for Generation Selfie. There's so many things in there that I don't give a shit about. It's amazing.
Yeah, I would
And
say just don't read that
yeah, but then you see
site.
the numbers under it with like $15 million investment and these kind of things. And new developers, when they come into the web, they probably would want to build one of those things. And that's the problem that we're having right now. We're having, on one side, we're having companies that that build things like BEM because, as you said, their own internal structure is so problematic that people keep working on code without communicating with each other. And then we build a framework. We keep telling everything is simple if you just keep CSS, JavaScript, and HTML separated.
Well, it's not simple.
Yeah.
It's that's the mistake that everybody makes. The stuff that we're talking about keeping that separated is not simple to do at all. It's hard to do well, which is why people come up with all these different frameworks and ways of working. It takes like actual thinking and really learning things like CSS and HTML. I'd say like 80% of developers I know just know 20% of HTML. And HTML, we all think we know HTML, but there's so much that we don't. And myself included, it's just we can't know everything. They split CSS into all these little bits and pieces. That's hard enough, So it's all hard. That's why they call it work.
Yeah, I feel that the last few years there was a massive engineering takeover, though. Everything, as you showed, all the tools that we have to use now, and everybody has to be a full stack developer. It's not good enough if you only. People feel like a fraud if they say like I only know CSS, and then like I'm not going to get a job anymore about this. And I think that's a terrible way of working because we don't need most of the stuff that we talked about. We just try to, and I quote PPK when he says like native versus web, the web has lost. Mainly because we try to simulate what native applications do with web technologies rather than concentrating on what the web is better at that a native app can never do. Do you think there's a way to get people more excited about what the web does that native doesn't do?
I don't think you can change people. I think you can. I think you can change the way you are, the way you work, and if enough people really care about it, then it's going to happen. And maybe it won't. But there are always going to be people who are proud of the way they do things and try to do the best work possible. And we might all feel stupid while doing it because of all this new stuff that's going on. I feel pretty much stupid every single day. I'm reading. I can't keep up. It's hard to keep up with all the stuff going on. You want to learn everything, but it's just. It used to be that we could actually know everything there was to know about making a website. Remember that? No? Yeah, you weren't born yet.
Well, by the time you learn the new stuff, the next article comes out where it's considered harmful.
Yeah.
That's the other interesting bit. Like, this is great. No, don't do that anymore.
And then top 10 reasons why it's harmful.
Yeah, and there's one weird trick to do. Like, yeah, it's an interesting it's an interesting experience though. Like I say, the job interviews as well. The amount of job interviews that I see for junior developers, I would not be able to get a job, and I'm 3 levels above those guys.
Yeah, it's hard. I would be terrified to be on the job market right now. It's just the stuff that's being asked for as well. It's all just like education. It's all tool based. Like what languages do you know? What do you work with BEM? We need a Bootstrap developer. I actually saw a job opening for a Bootstrap developer. I'm like, I could probably do that. I'll study Bootstrap and work's slow right now.
Yeah, it is kind of that the market doesn't have enough developers. We need a lot of people, and we make it really hard and scare them off before we actually start hiring them.
Right. Oh, I want to clarify something, by the way, about Bootstrap. As with BEM and the other things, I'm not down on Bootstrap to be down on Bootstrap. Bootstrap's really useful for certain situations, right? But it's the way people use it, and that goes for anything, right? BEM or whatever. it's the way people use these things. That's what you have to look at critically. So
The conformity.
not hating on Bootstrap.
The conformity cracks me up. We said that yesterday night. Almost every website nowadays is a massive header. Then it's three different columns next to each other. A long pull quote, some more text, and then in the footer it says "made with love by somebody in some city."
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
We all build the same stuff and call it differently. It's quite amazing, and how it became so. We laughed at templates of Dreamweaver back then, and now we actually build these things by hand that all look the same.
Yeah. Yeah, we kind of build pretty containers, really, oftentimes. So, and they kind of all look alike. But I think that's the same with every design. I know back when I did print design, print designers would always look through the design annuals, all the people who had won prizes, and that kind of determined the look of a lot of the stuff that was made the following year. So that's just the way it happens. I think the whole idea is to just relax a bit.
Now, I have a crazy idea right now, which is also why I work where I'm working right now. I want to fix the stuff that you said before. Like, we put so much crap on the web, we never got a chance to fix again. And I think just going back in your own company and just taking the time that you would put into like learning a new JavaScript library that tomorrow is forgotten, just fixing some of the things that you didn't have time to fix before is quite rewarding. I found doing that. I deleted stuff from the dead links. But I deleted stuff from the internet that's just crap that nobody looked at anymore. And I learned from my mistakes back then as well. Maybe it's time to clean up the internet that we hate every single day that we have to use, to maybe go out to companies that do ticket sales websites or like room booking websites and these kind of things. For years and years I talked to people in web development. These are the websites that we have to use every day and we hate. And every time I talk to a designer about this, somebody who's on stage here telling us what the next internet is going to be, and why don't we do something about this? Well, they would never listen to us. I think we never tried.
Well, I know a pretty big Italian guy who can, take care of that for you.
That sounds like a New York thing. Like, I know a guy from Little Italy that will get rid
We'll
of the
take
stuff
care
for
of
you.
the problem.
Yeah. No, but there's so much.
There's nothing violence won't solve, Chris. That's,
Fair enough. No, and I think there's a lot of stuff to be repaired, and rather than just letting it rot for the next 10 years, let's fix it and get a bit of joy out of that one, maybe.
I agree. That's why refactoring is not a bad thing. You can go back and fix stuff, and it feels good when you're done. It's like mowing your lawn or whatever. So.
And with that kind of old man message, thank you very much.